Hey guys, welcome to the third part of this lesson 2, the rise of liberalism. So you've learned about these three different time periods. You've learned about the Enlightenment philosophers. Now let's get into liberalism a little bit here. So we are now in the late 1700s, and the ideas promoted by the Enlightenment philosophers contributed to the rise of a new ideology. So just to help you out here, we are now in this part of your partial notes. Here we go, right there. There it is. So if you go to this section of your partial notes, then you can continue adding notes to that. So you learned about the beliefs of these Enlightenment philosophers. Well, their ideas were taken and put into practice. And they created this new ideology called liberalism. Okay, so liberalism is sort of the dominant ideology of the Western world today, which is why we learn about it, and it's so important for us because it's a big deal for us. So liberalism is an ideology that focuses on the values of individualism, right? So you learned about collectivism, you learned about individualism. Well, the principles of individualism, these are also known as the principles of collectivism. Okay, sorry, the principles of liberalism. Okay, so liberalism is founded on these principles, these ideas that all people should be able to own private property. There should be rule of law, right? So the law should be clearly stated and the law should apply to all people. There should be individual rights and freedoms guaranteed for all people, regardless of their wealth or their social status or anything like that. And people should be able to compete with each other to see who has who has most competence and most abilities. They should compete for success, and people should have economic freedom. You should be able to own property, and you should be able to keep it for yourself, and you should be able to buy and sell things as you wish. And people should act out of self-interest and be self-reliant. And importantly here, in a liberal society, there should be limited government. The government should give you a lot of freedoms and let you live your life. So when was liberalism embraced? Well, I'm going to get you to put your partial notes to the side here for a moment and pick up that big blank sheet of paper that I gave you in class that is to be used for creating your timeline. Okay, so it's the one that you can fold in the center. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, make sure you grab a sheet of paper from me next time you see me so that you can do this next part of the video using that big sheet of paper. Okay, so here's your big timeline of Social 30. All the major events of Social 30 have been placed on this timeline. So you've got your line, and then you've got some little cross sections to go through it. I've numbered these important years. This is not to scale because we study certain time periods in greater detail than others. So the scale is off, but that's intentional. And so we've already learned about these first three time periods, the Middle Ages, which are from the 500s all the way to the 1300s, the Renaissance from the 1300s into the end of the 1500s, the Enlightenment, right? And that is from the 1600s all the way towards the end of the 1700s. So this is intentional. You'll see that my little thing here does not go all the way to the year 1800. That's on purpose. And then down here, you can create a second line. And on this second line, you can keep track of economic systems. So in green, we'll have the economic systems. Well, the economic system that was used throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment period, this was mercantilism. Okay, so mercantilism is controlled by the king or the queen. There's no open competition. There's a lot of monopolies that are given to the king and queen's allies in society, right? So you might remember this picture from Social 10, where the monarch grants authority to a company to operate a business in one of its colonies, and then the colony will provide natural resources to the company, and the company has to give a portion of its profits to the monarch. So who benefits the most? Well, the monarch, right? And then if another company wants to compete with this company here, it usually doesn't really work out that way because we have something called monopolies where there is no competition. Mono means one, right? There's just one company that runs an entire industry. Okay, so that's mercantilism, and that was the economic system used throughout the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Enlightenment period. Well, After the Enlightenment period, we embrace liberalism, and we also embrace a new economic system called laissez-faire capitalism, which was heavily promoted by people such as Adam Smith, right? The ideology that was being used throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment was called feudalism, right? You guys know that feudalism looked like this, where there were different social classes of people who had different amounts of privilege in society. Well, that is thrown away, right? This brings an end to feudalism. We now embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment and create a new society based on liberalism, right? So liberalism has the word liberty in it, right? Which means freedom, right? Freedom from who and from what? Well, freedom from the king and freedom from social classes, right? So now people are free to move up and down the social ladder all they want, and they're free to keep their own property and free from the government, right? We now have limited government, okay? Well, liberalism evolved over the years. So you can see this line right here is in the early to mid 1900s. Well, liberalism did not stay the way it was. It was decided that liberalism needed to change, and it did change. And so we now call this new form of liberalism modern liberalism. Okay, but now we look back and it's like, okay, well, we now have modern liberalism. What are we going to call that old form of liberalism? Well, we now call that old form of liberalism classical liberalism. So classical liberalism is the type of liberalism that was practiced throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. But then since the early to mid 1900s, we've practiced a new type of liberalism called modern liberalism. Okay, and it looks different from the way it did back in the 1800s. Okay, so which events here in the late 1700s triggered this transition from feudalism to classical liberalism? Well, there were some important revolutions, right? So first there was the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783. By the way, you can put all of this on your timeline sheet, right? So here's a picture, or not a picture. Yeah, it is a picture, I guess. It's a drawing of the American Revolution, right? So the Americans, they were colonies of the British Empire, and they were under control of the king, and they decided that they wanted to rid themselves of the British Empire, and they wanted to be independent. And so they revolted, they had a war against the British, and they won that war, and they were able to form a new independent country. And they declared that, they declared this. They said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, so you know that at the time, the United States was a slave-based society, right? So they had an entire segment of their population which was enslaved by the majority. And so this document was sort of was created as sort of a signal to a lot of the people who wanted to get rid of slavery, right? So the Enlightenment ideals, the ideas of the Enlightenment were now included in these important documents that were created by the Americans in their revolution. And that gave a lot of steam to those who wanted to abolish slavery. Okay, so anyway, American Revolution, another important one, French Revolution, right? 1789, 1799, the French, they were living under a king and a queen at the time, and they were living in feudalism, and they wanted to break free of that. And so they had their revolution. They got rid of their king and queen, right? As you learned in Social 20, it was a pretty violent revolution, very bloody. They did some pretty nasty things. And they created a new society based on liberalism. Although you learned that it wasn't great at first. It took a while before the French eventually created what we would now call a liberal society. Okay, you can add a few extra things to your timeline here. The period that comes next, from the late 1700s throughout the 1800s into the early 1900s, we call this the Industrial Revolution. So you're going to learn about that in the next lesson, the Industrial Revolution. And then you can add a few dark chapters here. World War I, was from 1914 to 1918, and World War II was from 1939 till 1945. Right, so all of these important moments will help you understand how things went throughout the course of this course. All right, so anyway, that's that. So we got some important documents here, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This was part of the French Revolution, right? And this contained the Enlightenment ideas of individual rights and freedoms and equality in the eyes of the law. Okay, so this brought an end to feudalism. It brought an end to monarchy, right? So the legacy of the Enlightenment. There were some liberal revolutions, as we learned, that started in America, but then they continued in other places, right? Amsterdam, which is in the Netherlands, Brussels, which is in Belgium, and then Paris, in France, in the late 1780s. These were all revolutions that took place where they replaced feudalism with liberalism. So there was reform, democracy, the creation of republics, and that was all spreading across Europe. And so it gave birth to liberal democracies. We're going to talk about liberal democracies in the next lesson. However, it's important to talk about the contribution of the Haudenosaunee to liberalism. So you can go back to your partial notes. I'm sure you did a great job doing your timeline on the big paper. But go back to your partial notes, and you'll see at the bottom of the page there. Let's see if I can show you here. There we go, right here, down at the bottom, the contribution of the Haudenosaunee to liberalism. So let's take a look at this. So the Haudenosaunee, at one point we used to refer to them as the Iroquois. Some people, you might still hear people refer to them as the Iroquois or the Six Nations, right? Six Nation Confederacy. So they live over here, right? So partly in the United States and partly in Canada, near Ontario, right? Or in Ontario partly. And so this was one of the first and longest lasting participatory democracies in the world. And it was formed between 1400 and 1600, right? So at a time where Europe was living in feudalism, this confederacy was, in many ways, quite advanced in terms of its government style, right? So it included 5 different nations, but then they added a 6th nation later on, so it became 6 nations, right? And each nation has its own council and chief who are selected by the clan mother, and they address the nation's internal affairs. And so in your partial notes, you'll see you have the word the. You can add to that the Great Law of Peace is the constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, right? So they have a constitution. The Great Law of Peace is what it's called. And this constitution guarantees individual rights and freedoms, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and guarantees equal participation in society, including between men and women. So some historians say that the writers of the American Constitution had a lot of contact with the Haudenosaunee and were influenced by their ideas. All right, so there are some similarities between the American Constitution and the Great Law of Peace. So you can, as I make this list here, you can put them in your partial notes. I know it's purple, it's meant to be blue. Oops, sorry about that, but you can write those down. So they have elected leaders, right? That's something they have in common between the Americans and the Haudenosaunee. They have leadership based on merit, right? Based on, so merit means deserving something, earning something, right? So you rise to a position of leadership if you have earned it, if you've proved yourself to be worthy. The rule of law, that the law applies equally to all people, regardless of who you are, and equality, right? So all of those things are things that that are similar between the American Constitution and the Great Law of Peace, right? However, some historians disagree. So it is a bit of a debate. There are some historians who say that they believe the Haudenosaunee influenced the American framers of the Constitution and influenced liberalism as a result. However, other historians say, no, we don't think so. So it's a bit of a debate. Some historians say, no, we think that the main influences of the American Constitution were European and largely the Enlightenment philosophers that you guys learned about in this lesson. So it's good for you guys to know that this debate exists, so that you can be aware of it, right? And it's an interesting thing. So anyway, that's that. That is lesson 2. I hope you learned a few things, and I'll see you in class.